Just look at him, of course he didn't like women. Basically, ye old men's rights group. There's virtually no record of any black women being against suffrage. They did some classic old school Karen behavior. Hi, my name's Legia. I'm a real-life lawyer and I'm on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. Welcome. Last week was the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Well, some women, but we'll get into that. So let's talk about it. Before we start, I'd like to give the following disclaimer, and that is that I'm a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer, and nothing that I say here should be construed as legal advice. Please seek the advice of a licensed attorney if you have any legal questions. If you find this video helpful, informational, or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe to see more from me. Let's go. No history of the women's suffrage movement is complete without mentioning the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention. I will note that this was a meeting of pretty much all white suffragists. The only African American in attendance was Frederick Douglass. He was a strong supporter of the women's rights to vote. So that Seneca Falls meeting in 1848 didn't lead to a ton of change, but it was a momentous occasion. There's an 1875 Supreme Court case in which a woman named Virginia Minor tried to vote in a Missouri election but was denied. She then sued. She had a lawyer husband, so that made it easier. And her argument was that being denied the right to vote denied her all of the rights of citizenship guaranteed to her under the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court's opinion was unanimous, and it was written by Chief Justice Morrison Waite, who, just look at him, of course he didn't like women. The court at that point ruled that yes, Minor was a citizen, but the 14th Amendment and the rights of citizenship did not include the right to vote, and that the right to vote was not a constitutionally protected right. Obviously, the 19th Amendment went on to overrule this case. However, the holding was relied upon well into the 20th century to justify things like polling taxes and entrance exams in order to vote, which were used to disenfranchise largely black voters, especially in the South. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Supreme Court found that voting is a fundamental right protected under the 14th Amendment. This case, however, Minor v. Happersett, did spark a movement towards national suffrage as opposed to state-by-state suffrage. And this movement included pushing for a constitutional amendment. The actual passage of laws that allowed women the right to vote didn't start gaining momentum until the end of the 1800s, and it actually mainly gained momentum in the West. States like Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Washington were some of the first states to grant women the right to vote. As this momentum grew, women on the East Coast, specifically elite white women for the most part, grew also in their popularity and were able to push for a referendum finally in 1917 in New York. There had been earlier referendums to allow women to vote in New York, but they did not pass. It was not until 1917 that women finally got the right to vote in New York. It's important to note that most women's suffrage groups and organizations were for whites only. It was a white women's elitist movement in a lot of ways. Black women, on the other hand, formed their own organizations. Some notable black women suffragists were Sojourner Truth, Nannie Helen Burroughs, who led the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was also a civil rights activist who spoke out against lynchings and founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, Sarah Parker Remond, and Mary Church Terrell, who founded the National Association of Colored Women. The women's suffrage movement was one of the first, if not the first, movement that used things like marches, picketing, and the use of pins and other memorabilia to push for change. The women's suffrage movement was seen as a really powerful movement because it made sure that suffrage was on the minds of everyone in the nation. Suffragists also made leaflets, posters, and newspapers when the mainstream media refused to cover them, including the Women's Era, which was the first newspaper founded by a black woman in the United States. So there was a huge movement pushing for an amendment to the United States Constitution to ensure that women had the right to vote, and that culminated with Congress finally passing the 19th Amendment. After it was passed in both houses of Congress, it had to be ratified by the states. 3/4 of the states had to ratify the amendment, and they did so by the summer of 1920, 100 years ago last week. So the text of the 19th Amendment is really straightforward, and it says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." It is important to note, too, that there were many women who were against the passage of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage generally. These were usually elite women who were married to elite men, especially in Washington, D.C. These were also white women. There's virtually no record of any black women being against suffrage. They did some classic old school Karen behavior. Some of these anti-suffragists argued that giving women the vote would undermine one of her paramount strengths, and that was in focusing on the public good and not on politics or personal gain. And many didn't think that women needed or even wanted the vote. Obviously, there were a lot of men who were against suffrage for women as well, and they founded societies such as Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Women, which became commonly known as Man's Suffrage Association, opposed to women's suffrage. Basically, ye old men's rights group. But a lot of the arguments that anti-suffragists used are arguments that are still made today when it comes to people who are anti-feminism or people who have more conservative ideals of what it means to be a woman. Those ideas include the idea that motherhood and femininity need to be defended, and that women's place belongs in the home, and that having women involved in politics would unsex her. And also, obviously, strong family values require that women must stay in the home. There's also kind of this connection between feminism and socialism, and that's something that was carried through into the 1970s by people like Phyllis Schlafly, who strongly opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. So these issues that were being argued 100 years ago regarding women's right to vote are still kind of at the forefront of a lot of discourse, even though they have changed a little bit or are veiled in other ways. All right, so it's been 100 years. How far have women come now that we have the right to vote? Well, in 100 years, no woman has made it into the White House as VP or president. Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman to run for president on a major party ticket. She did so in 1964. Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman to run for president on a major ticket, which she did in 1972. Hillary Clinton, in the election of 2016, is the first woman to ever actually win a major party's nomination for president. 2016. So it took almost 100 years just to get a woman on the ticket, like the official ticket. And she was beat by an orange. And now obviously Kamala Harris is the first black woman and the first person of Indian descent to make it on the presidential ticket. And she may become the first woman to ever set foot in the White House as VP or president. Whatever your views are on her, that's a pretty huge thing considering it's been 100 years since women have been able to vote. There are only 26 women in the Senate out of 100, and there are only 101 women in the House out of 435 members. Only 9 states out of, I'll remind you, 50 have female governors. However, I would also like to point out that even though I'm saying that women had the right to vote 100 years ago, not all women had the right to vote 100 years ago. Many women continued to be disenfranchised. For example, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants were not allowed to become U.S. citizens. Native Americans were not considered to be citizens until the Snyder Act of 1924, and many citizens of color were disenfranchised because of poll taxes and literacy tests and other voter suppression methods. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 barred poll taxes and literacy tests. However, disenfranchisement continues to this day in the form of fees and voter ID laws. Plus, the excessive prosecution and imprisonment of black and brown people in the United States ensures that disenfranchisement will continue. Specifically, I'd like to address voter ID laws. In the United States, 11% of citizens do not have IDs. This is largely due to the fact that IDs are expensive. If there's no fee associated with getting the ID, then there's at least a fee associated with getting a hold of your birth certificate. There's travel expenses. There's the time that it takes to get an ID. I don't know if you've ever sat in a DMV, but it takes a minute. And I don't know about you, but most people don't have a morning to take off and just go sit in the DMV, especially if you're already struggling to get by. The ACLU has estimated that it costs between $75 and $175, all expenses included, to get an ID. That's impossible for some people. When you look at the fact that the average American often can't afford a $500 emergency and is living paycheck to paycheck, especially in times of the pandemic, you begin to understand how oppressive a voter ID law can be. Your right to vote should not depend on your ability to come up with $175 to buy an ID. It's a fundamental right that's protected under the Constitution. There's also a racial element to this. 25% of African Americans do not have IDs, as opposed to 8% of whites. So when you pass a law that says that people are required to bring an ID in order to vote, it is directly affecting many, many more African Americans than it's affecting whites. A recent study also found that minority voters are the ones that are more often questioned about their IDs as opposed to white voters, and that requiring IDs reduces voter turnout amongst minority voters. A recent study found that since the year 2000, there were only 31 credible allegations of voter identity fraud in the United States. And that's the type of crime that these ID laws are meant to protect against. Out of the millions of people that have voted in the past 20 years, only 31 of them have attempted to commit this fraud. So when you look at the facts and the data, the only real reason underlying the creation of voter ID laws is for disenfranchisement of black and brown people. And I'm bringing this all up because this year's election is so important and there is so much danger of disenfranchisement that could happen. There will be fewer polling places available for people to vote at, which means that rural voters and people who have a hard time traveling are going to be disenfranchised. There is growing doubts of the ability of the USPS to handle the number of mail-in ballots that are going to be sent this year, and there's the increased fear that if you go and vote, you could be infected with a deadly disease and die. Okay, so this is really overwhelming, but what can you do? Get your absentee ballot and mail it in as soon as possible, or drop it off at your local election office. Yes, you can go physically bring your absentee ballot and drop it off if you know where your election office is. I've linked it down below. 40 states plus the District of Columbia allow for early in-person voting, so you can bypass the USPS entirely, go in person, avoid the crowds, and vote early. I've included a link to that down below. Some states are implementing drop boxes where you can drive and drop your ballot into the box. This has had varying levels of success, though there is an interesting story where a car ran into a drop box and all of its contents were still safe. So the security of these drop boxes is maybe less questionable than some people think. And if you are able to, show up on election day and stand in that line and stay in that line. If you are in line before the close of polling, you should be allowed to vote. If you're not allowed to vote or you're seeing other voter suppression methods, you can call the ACLU. They have a specific hotline for it. Obviously, when standing in line, practice social distancing and wear your mask. I voted in person for my primary here in August, and it was easy. There was a hand sanitizing station on the way in and a hand sanitizing station on the way out, and I came within 6 feet of no one. It took 2 minutes. If you have neighbors or friends that might need assistance, either with questions about polling places or election day procedures in general, or with transportation to get to the polling place, reach out to them. Talk to your family members, especially your suburban family members. They still might find it a lot easier this year to just stay home and not vote. Don't let them. Host a virtual ballot party where you just discuss what's going to be on your ballot and how to vote and voting procedures. And most importantly, do whatever it takes to make sure that you are voting this November. I get it if you're really disillusioned with the voting process and with politics right now. I get it. There's not a lot to be excited about in our electoral system or in the people who are running in it. But voting is a small act that should be a part of your larger activist plan. It's a right that, as long as you're not a white man who owns land, a lot of people have fought for before you. So don't take it for granted. There's a great New York Times article with a ton of pictures and other information regarding the past 100 years of women's suffrage. I'll link it down below. It's been a source that has helped me a lot for the creation of today's video. And I thank you so much for joining me for today's video. If you found it interesting, please give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me. Comment below if you have questions about anything that you'd like me to cover in future videos. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Vote in November. Goodbye!